Religion has profoundly influenced the sweeping American narrative, perhaps more than any other force in our history, from the time of the indigenous peoples to the present day. The National Museum of American Religion tells the surprising and compelling story of what religion has done to America and what America has done to religion, including the establishment of the revolutionary and indispensable idea of religious freedom as a governing principle in the U.S., inviting all to explore the role of religion in shaping the social, political, economic, and cultural lives of Americans and thus America itself. Join us for Season 3 of our podcast series, Religion in the American Experience, as we follow scholars and others deep into America's religious history and learn how it can inform and animate us as citizens grappling with complex questions of governance and American purpose in the 21st century. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Religion in the American Experience. I am glad you're here. Today we're going to pull on this thread in the American religious tapestry, the Nation of Islam, a 20th century American religious movement brought to national consciousness by the 1960s Black Power movement, Muhammad Ali, and Malcolm X, and which also has a deep and significant history with implications for 21st century work in the public square. To do this, Joseph Stuart, an assistant professor of history at Brigham Young University and a well-known expert on Nation of Islam, has agreed to help. Joseph, thank you so much for taking time out of your very hectic university schedule to be with us today.
It's a joy to be able to do so. Thanks for having me, Chris.
You bet. First, I'd love to know, and I think our listeners would love to know, how you came to be so interested in this relatively small religious movement.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, as an undergraduate at Brigham Young University, I was assigned to read the autobiography of Malcolm X in a Modern America class. And that's many people's introduction to the Nation of Islam is through Brother Malcolm, either through the autobiography or through the film directed by Spike Lee, um, entitled Malcolm X. And so after reading that and then pursuing graduate study in religion at the University of Virginia, I actually had a class for the Nation of Islam, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Scientology. Were put into conversation with each other. Kathleen Flake called the class American Religious Innovation. And as I continued to dig deeper and deeper into the religion, just found myself fascinated and asking lots of questions about what are the connections between race and politics and gender in the American experience. And the Nation of Islam, I think, provides a really great case study for better understanding how so many of these broad categories operate in the United States and beyond.
Hey, super. That's a compelling story. I think if I were in your shoes, I'd have followed your path as well. That class at UVA sounds fascinating. So Joseph, why don't you briefly describe for us both the American and the American religious landscape at the time of the Nation of Islam's birth? And we'll get to the actual origin story next, but I want our listeners to understand sort of the landscape in general terms here, because I think that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Nation of Islam, in my mind, grows out of two greats in American history. The first is the Great Migration. So this is the outmigration of African Americans from rural areas in the U.S. South to the urban North. So think like Chicago, Cleveland, New York, Philadelphia. To the West, so think San Francisco, Los Angeles, um, and other locations that had more economic opportunity, but then also from rural locations to urban locations in the South. So famously from rural Georgia to Atlanta or to New Orleans or Nashville or Charleston, South Carolina. The other is the Great Depression. So this enormous negative global event where there's really not a great way to put it that the world economy slowed and nearly uh, disappeared, for want of a better term. That wages fell, um, the ability to employ and be employed fell drastically in the United States, among other nations. And this was particularly important because of the Great Migration, that many members of the Nation of Islam had moved from the Deep South to Detroit and other areas in the urban north and had found better jobs. They had been employed at Henry Ford's factories or GM or other places where they earned more money. That did not mean that they thought that their treatment was equal to whites or even to recent immigrants, but they were making more money and had more opportunity there. But when the Great Depression hits, African Americans are often the first to lose their jobs when companies aren't able to make payroll. And so they had come up north seeking the American dream, seeking these new opportunities that would be available to them. But then the Great Depression, which helped so many Americans, especially white Americans, it was really troubling for members of the Nation of Islam to recognize uh, that the federal government had little interest, little ability, or a marriage of the two, to help them in this moment of national as well as international crisis.
Okay. Um, Something briefly about the religious landscape. What was that looking like?
And then, so far as the religious landscape goes, uh, in the United States, because of religious freedom, many different kinds of new religious movements have flourished throughout American history. And I'm really partial to what the historian Judith Weisenfeld has called the growth of religio racial movements, or the idea of new religious movements that marry racial and religious identity. So, in Weisenfeld's work, she largely studies African American new religious movements that are at least in part birthed by the Great Migration, because once they're leaving the South, African American migrants, they have all sorts of new opportunities to join new religious movements, but also they're exposed to many more religious movements. So I say this advisedly, but in many small towns, there may be one or two denominations that one may be able to join or participate in to go to church to. And likely they're going to both be Christian. But if you are going to move up north or move to a city in the south or move out west, suddenly there are dozens or hundreds of possibilities for different religious groups that you could join. And so this is part of the beauty of the American experiment, is that there are new forms of religion being introduced, but also that folks have the freedom and opportunity to join a religion of their choosing, to follow the dictates of their own conscience.
Right. Okay. So what we've seen by the early 20th century is a flowering of religions in the United States.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
In part because of the Great Migration, which I mentioned, but also innovations in communication. So more newspapers, radio, the ability to reach those who might be interested in your religious message had never been simpler. And so that leads to the growth of new religious movements like the Nation of Islam.
Okay. Well, why don't you tell us that origin story, Joseph? I think that would be great for all of us to understand better. Many of our listeners probably don't know much at all about where this movement came from.
Sure. So the Nation of Islam is founded in early 1930s Detroit. So it's taking in place of the two contexts that I mentioned, the Great Depression and the Great Migration. And so there's a peddler, someone who is selling coats and other materials door to door, um, who goes by the name W.D. Farad. So it's Fard, but his followers say Farad, just if you encounter it reading in the wild there. And so what Farad does is he starts to hold cottage meetings is probably the best term. The idea that he would come into someone's home and share his religious message. And he's sharing them primarily with African Americans and other people of color in Detroit, but he's going to soon focus on African Americans in Detroit. And he's going to tell them that Allah, God, right, but Allah in an Arabic and an Islamic context, is a black man, and that he created black people in his image, and that white people were not part of God's plan, but arose as a demonic aspect to push back against black excellence, against black religion, and to oppress all black people. And so you can imagine hearing this message for the first time as an African American in Detroit. You have moved north, all of these things have happened to you, and you have not been able to come out from under the boot of white supremacy. And so suddenly a religion that teaches black supremacy and white inferiority could be pretty appealing in these cases. Now, it's not just that he has exciting ideas, and there's a great article from 1938, and I'm not in the habit of recommending articles that are this old, but a sociology grad student went and interviewed more than 200 families who belong to the Nation of Islam. Uh, Muslim families in Detroit in the mid 1930s, asking them about their experiences. And part of what I've always found compelling about this article is that they're saying, well, we recognize that racism still exists in the North, even after we had moved from the South, but also that the Christianity that we practiced in the South and then practiced again in the North before hearing this new message did nothing to stop white supremacy. The possibility was always there. I mean, listeners will be familiar with Frederick Douglass and centuries of thinkers of Black African descent who have used Christianity to push for racial equality and for equal treatment between the races. But nevertheless, as they had experienced Christianity, it was white centric, it was white led. And even when they belonged to African American congregations, many of those leaders were so concerned about what other white Christians thought or were concerned about existing within white power structures, meaning like governments and religious bodies that were governed by white folks, um, that the Nation of Islam argued that they lost the plot, that they had come to adopt the beliefs, the goals, the intentions of white people, and thus Christianity needed to be abandoned for God's true religion for the black man, as they called it, the Nation of Islam.
Did Mr. Farad, uh, invent this himself, or are there threads of this idea previous to him?
Yeah, so like most new religious movements, it's an assemblage, right, of different religious thoughts that are pulled together into a new interpretation or direction. So it's most often tied to the Moorish Science Temple of America. And this is something, again, that Judith Weisenfeld explores in her book, New World of Coming. But there's also the Garvey movement and Garveyites thinking about having Black autonomy, overcoming white supremacy, having a land of their own and a religion of their own that they can worship freely, that they can exist without having to worry about the violence of white America or white society throughout the world. There's also heavy Christian influences, and this is something that I believe we'll discuss later, but there's no small amount of controversy about whether the Nation of Islam is Islamic. So, as a scholar, I would say they identify as Muslim. That's really important to me. I'm fine to call them Muslims, but they don't practice Islam as a Sunni or Shia Muslim in the 1930s would have recognized it. And so there is a combination, a bricolage, if you will, of bringing together strains of different religious and political movements and bring them together in a way that presents a fresh new look at the world.
Okay. Do we know anything else about Mr. Farad, his family, his background? I mean, he said he was a peddler, and then he also had these religious ideas that he shared that sort of grew into an actual movement.
Yeah, so Farad is a compelling character for many reasons. Very little is known. It seems that he came from the West Coast, probably from Los Angeles to Detroit, in order to make money selling coats door to door as a peddler. But part of what is important to keep in mind is that this is before social security cards. This is before you had to present a birth certificate to be able to get a job. It was a lot easier for people to be able to move around.
Right.
And so, as Farad is moving around, what historians have been able to nail down is that he told a whole lot of different stories about where he came from. So, it seems likely he was born on the West Coast, um, perhaps in Oceania, so New Zealand, in Southeast Asia. He told his followers that he came from Mecca, so, tying his identity to Islam in that way.
Right.
But from my reading of the evidence, it seems he was probably born in the United States in Portland, Oregon, and then moved south to Los Angeles. He had a common law wife, which is to say, not legally married, but were recognized as a couple in the community. And it seems likely that he also had been imprisoned at some point in his life. Um, I'm always hesitant to share that detail, though, because his imprisonment has been used against members of the Nation of Islam to say is a fraud or trying to or was disingenuous in the religious teachings that he had.
Right.
And I think it's just important for us as listeners, as learners about American religion, to recognize that everyone has a story and that there is something that is compelling there, and whether one has been to prison or not has very little bearing on whether people find your message compelling in a sort of grand theological sense.
Sure. Yep. Okay, so Nation of Islam founded. Uh, Now the next big figure we hear about, or the biggest, is Elijah Muhammad. Tell us about him, Joseph.
Yeah, so Elijah Muhammad is born as Elijah Poole in rural Georgia, and he and his family eventually moved to Detroit in the 1920s. And so he sees himself as part of the American success story of the Great Migration in the 1920s, which is he moved north, he got a good job. He's not union, but he is making far more money than he would have if he was in Georgia. And then with the Great Depression, he loses his job and is desperate for a sense of self, for trying to find a message that will help him to orient himself to the world. And there are different family accounts, but the one that I find most compelling is that his wife is the one who encouraged him to go to one of W.D. Farad's cottage meetings. And as he comes into this meeting, Farad recognizes him as someone who would potentially be a great convert to his cause. And over time, after Elijah Poole and many of his family members joined the Nation of Islam, Elijah Poole is given the name Elijah Karim, and eventually Elijah Muhammad. Something that's important to keep in mind with the Nation of Islam is they're really committed to shedding all forms of white identity, so religious, but then also personal. So what Farad and then later on Muhammad and other leaders would argue is that many of the surnames, family names, last names that African Americans have in the United States are names of former enslavers, right?
Right.
That they are connected to Smith or Roberts or Jones. Those are not names that commonly come from West Africa, especially before English is spoken in West Africa frequently. And so giving Elijah Muhammad this new name also empowers him to become a new person. I don't mean in a sort of fraudulent sense. What I mean here is that with a new name, he is taking on new responsibilities and he's able to come into his own. He is no longer someone who moved from Georgia to Detroit and lost his job. Rather, he's a religious leader in an exciting new religious movement, and people look to him for direction. Now, there's a very long story for how W.D. Farad ends up leaving Detroit and the Nation of Islam, uh, to which his common law wife reported seeing him once, but then no one ever really reports seeing W.D. Farad again um, in 1934. And if folks would like to read more, I'm going to put together a blog post to go together with this, but thinking about different circumstances where Farad left, there were many choices for members of the Nation of Islam to follow. And many of them ultimately chose Elijah Muhammad. And he led the movement from approximately mid 1934, some would say 1935, until his death in 1975.
So when it was founded in the late 20s in Chicago, how big was it about 19, when Farad leaves and Elijah assumes the mantle of leadership? How many people are we talking about membership
Yeah, so
wise?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's, again, a matter of some dispute. The Detroit Police Department will say 5,000 by 1938, but the Nation of Islam will say 8,000 by 1938. And numbers fluctuate, circulate, certainly. But it's important to keep in mind that this is a pretty fast growing group. So most folks would place like the formal organization of the Nation of Islam to about 1932. To have 5,000 followers within 3 or 4 years or 8,000 followers suggests the power of the narrative that Farad and then Muhammad was teaching to migrants to Detroit and other places in the urban north eventually
Right.
about Black superiority and about the need for a religion other than Christianity to save Black people.
Right. Joseph, was this very much a religious movement that stayed in the 20s and 30s in Michigan, or did it start to spread nationally?
Yeah, so almost as soon as it begins, it starts to spread to other communities in the urban north. So as it begins in Detroit, eventually Chicago, Milwaukee, and then also to Washington, D.C. So again, I just want to call listeners to the fact that it is spreading to cities where lots of Black folks have moved from the South to the North. And this is a pattern that's going to continue even to the present day for the Nation of Islam, that there are more mosques what were formerly called temples, but are now called mosques of the Nation of Islam. Most of them are above what we would today call the Mason-Dixon line as well. So there's certainly
Mm.
a contextual appeal of recognizing that the federal government has not succeeded in protecting Black people in the way that the Constitution and just uh, the sort of founding documents that Martin Luther King and others will play on to talk about ideas of equality. Um, there's a real appeal for those who have not um, had full access to the American dream.
Right. I do wanna go back briefly and sort of explore this religious concept that white people are demonic, that they're not created in the image of God. What what did this particular doctrine do for the believers and people around them that heard this?
Yeah, this is a big question. It's something that folks like me who studied the Nation of Islam spend a lot of time thinking about. And I think one of the ways to frame it is first to say that it's pretty clear early on that it is shocking a lot of uh, Farad's audience and then Muhammad's audiences. It is something that takes quite a while for people to get used to. It's uh, it's a shocking doctrine, but that may also lend to its appeal in causing a major rethink of one's orientation to the world. Another way of thinking about it is that eugenics is an accepted form of doing science and social science in the world, with many scientists, anthropologists, and others arguing that Black people were naturally, quote unquote, naturally inferior for many reasons. And so, what Farad teaches is that after Allah had created Black people in his image, right, that there was an evil scientist named Yaqub who decided that he would try many new experiments to see if he could create a new race of human beings by finding the lightest skinned people that he could and breeding them selectively over thousands of years. And so, again, this is part of the founding myth. I'm not endorsing this view. What the Nation of Islam teaches is that Yaqub ended up creating different races. So, red, meaning indigenous people at the time, yellow, meaning Asian people in the parlance of the time, and then eventually white. And part of what's peculiar about this racial eugenic experiment is that Yaqub, as he is having groups breed together here, um, is that the godliness or the affinity for Islam is also leaving as the melanin leaves the skin. So as the skin color is changing, so is the affinity for Islam. And so what the Nation of Islam will teach is that white people are eventually banished from the presence of Black people. They're sent to the caves of Europe, is often the phrase that's used. And they invent Christianity as a way of coping from not being allowed into Black communities. And
Okay.
so, as white folks are living in the caves of Europe and practicing Christianity, uh, Allah and the Black folks in Yaqub's community recognize the great evil that Yaqub has done. And Allah says that He will allow these white people to punish and to oppress white folks for losing sight of what's most important, for allowing someone like Yaqub to complete these scientific experiments. But He promises to come back and destroy all vestiges of white people and whiteness um, in what Elijah Muhammad would describe as a mother plane. So today, you and I might think of a UFO in this way to come in and destroy all white people. And so part of what is compelling about this is one, it's flipping the eugenic script on its head. It's not saying, no, Black people are not inferior, white people are those who are inferior. And then the second is promised redemption, the idea that just around the corner, Allah will come back and restore things and make all things right and correct. And so
Okay.
I think that a lot of Christians who are listening or those who study Christianity will recognize the sort of parallels in this. Um, Promising that someone will come and wipe all tears from their eyes and make all things just and right and get rid of all evil influences in the world.
Right.
And so that's part of the appeal for members of the Nation of Islam here is, again, not only um, that they have a narrative that frames them as racially superior, but also that all things will be made right and will be made right in short order.
Right. Okay. Very, very helpful. Let's move to two other personalities that our listeners will certainly have heard about: Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X.
Yeah, so Malcolm X grows up in Michigan outside of Detroit. and faces a pretty grim childhood. His father dies while he is pretty young. He always believed that his father was murdered, but historians have gone back through and seen the story may be more complicated than that. His mother is eventually committed um, to an asylum, and he is sent to live with family members out east in Boston. He eventually goes to Detroit and gets involved in jazz clubs there, um, and becomes a petty criminal in New York and in Boston. In prison, he receives a letter from his brother saying, "Start living right," by which his brother meant stop eating pork and stop smoking cigarettes, and I will send you more news for how you can escape from prison. And so Malcolm, uh, I mean, it's hard to get inside Malcolm's head for this, but it seems like something has to give. I have to be willing to put my trust in something here. And eventually, Malcolm converts to the Nation of Islam after his brother had and tells him more about it in prison. He corresponds with Elijah Muhammad while he's in prison. And this is pretty emblematic of many Black men's introduction to the Nation of Islam. Not that they're personally corresponding with Elijah Muhammad, but in many ways have hit rock bottom. They're in prison. They didn't receive the promises of the GI Bill after World War II, or otherwise have not been. They have not been full recipients of the American dream. So, recognizing the structural oppression that faced Black people in this time, finding a religion that gave them hope and dignity and a way forward, where Black people were good and people should want to be Black, and that they should uh, join Islam not only because it's the correct religion, but it's the religion of their ancestors, presents a pretty compelling narrative. Now, Malcolm's one of the most charismatic speakers of the 20th century. And if any listeners want to go onto YouTube and hear some of the things uh, that he spoke about to college campuses or other formal settings, he has a really great rhythmic and powerful way of speaking. He knows how to get to the center of what's most important and what he's arguing, and he becomes a national minister, like the national and international representative for the Nation of Islam. Elijah Muhammad had many positive attributes, but he was not as compelling a speaker. And so Malcolm gains all of this notoriety, and many members of the Nation of Islam, including Elijah Muhammad, seem to become jealous of Malcolm's capacity to reach others, to go on radio and television and reach an audience that they otherwise cannot. It's also important to keep in mind that Brother Malcolm is traveling abroad and meeting Muslims whose skin colors are very different. And so listeners may say, yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. Anyone can have any sort of skin color and be a member of any sort of religion. But it was a wake-up call to Malcolm, who had learned that all Muslims had black skin, to suddenly go to the Middle East and see a wider spectrum of skin pigmentation for others. And Malcolm was also especially attuned to the international concern for decolonization and for Black human rights throughout the world. And so that's what's really important to keep in mind with Malcolm, is that he joins the Nation of Islam at a low point in his life. He rises to pretty meteoric highs, but he's really, really good at reaching both the individual on the street, but also speaking to broad global concerns. And this is at least oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask, what year did he join the Nation of Islam?
So he joins the Nation of Islam in, oh, wow.
Approximately. Are we talking about the?
Yeah. So he joins the Nation of Islam in approximately 1950.
Okay.
And he's going to be assassinated in 1965. So he has a pretty meteoric career from someone who was in prison and then becomes an international spokesman for Black people across the globe.
And what are we talking about membership numbers of of Islam in the 50s, 60s? Where are we at?
So this is a great question. And again, it's a matter of some dispute. The Nation of Islam would say between 500,000 and 3 million, depending on who you're speaking to in the late 1950s, early 1960s. I personally think it's probably closer to the 500,000 number.
Okay.
But so membership does not negate impact, right?
Yeah.
At least in part because Malcolm is such a prodigious speaker, and because of the new medium of television, the Nation of Islam is on a lot of people's minds, even if they have no intention of joining, or even if they completely disagree with what the Nation of Islam teaches.
Right. Can you describe the impact that Malcolm had on the Nation of Islam for those 15 years, including the impact he had on the country?
So, on the Nation of Islam, he was a compelling speaker and he brought a lot of people into the fold, so to speak. So, a lot of people joined the Nation of Islam because they heard Malcolm speak, because they found what he had to say was compelling. So, in the United States, again, mentioning the pretty small number of the Nation of Islam, there's a political science term called the Overton window. And so, for those on audio, I would encourage you just to Google a picture of the Overton window. But this is an idea that, and I'm holding up my hands here about 6 inches apart, that if this is the American political spectrum, but one side, so the left or the right, moves in a more extreme direction, it opens up way more room in the middle for that to be considered moderate. And so, with the Nation of Islam here, that teaches that all white people will be destroyed, that Black people should not integrate, they should have their own land and should never have to work with white people. Suddenly, Martin Luther King and his completely radical theology are a whole lot more appealing because he is presenting something that is less than um, full separation of the races and the full destruction of white people in uh, in the eschaton, at the second coming of Allah. And so I have always found it compelling that many of the victories associated with King and the Christian-led nonviolent civil rights movement uh, take place before Malcolm's assassination, because I think it was important for there always to be a point of comparison for this nonviolent Christian beloved community sort of orientation to interracial life in the United States versus the Nation of Islam's presentation of total racial separation. This is something that if folks are looking at more for this too, James Baldwin wrote a great book called The Fire Next Time that looks at these themes directly. And because it's Baldwin, it's beautiful, it's lyrical, but Baldwin also seems to pretty carefully understand why the Nation of Islam is so compelling. It may not be these ideas about Yaqub and an evil scientist and the creation of white people in this way, but rather that a lot of Black folks recognize that they have repeatedly gotten the short end of the stick and have faced racial oppression, uh, even as they practice Christianity, even as they live in the United States, even as they sign up to fight in world wars. Everything that they've done to show that they are Christian and American has failed to convince white people of their full personhood, their full Christianity. And so the Nation of Islam, while it's not gaining a lot of converts, 500,000 is nothing to sneeze at. It is nowhere near the number of Christians in the United States. But because Malcolm and Martin are interesting sparring partners, or at least their ideas are important sparring partners with each other, it leads to pretty significant changes in the way that many Americans are willing to accept integration and King's idea of the beloved community. But then also on the other end, as we move into the 1960s, the idea of Black liberation and Black power under Kwame Ture and then liberation theology for Christianity, a lot of them are still relying on Malcolm in important ways. Even if they're not quoting him, many of his ideas have become mainstream, as radical as they were 10 years before, and are still radical in the mid 1960s. They've become a way forward for many African American activists to push for a better world.
Very fascinating. I don't think I'd heard about that. What you just described. I'll have to pick up that book by James Baldwin. Okay, so let's jump to Muhammad Ali. Tell us that story, Joseph.
Yeah, so Muhammad Ali grows up in Louisville, Kentucky, Black Baptist, and he joins the Nation of Islam not when he's at his bottom like Malcolm, but rather when he is a gold medalist for the United States in boxing, and he finds the message of the Nation of Islam really compelling, rejecting Christianity, adopting Black supremacy, um, and white inferiority. And this is just really important to keep in mind that Muhammad Ali, we recognize him today as, or many Americans recognize him today as one of the most important athletes to ever live, one of the most important civil rights activists to ever live. And he was certainly well known. He's a gold medalist. He's the heavyweight champ. But at the same time, he recognizes that he will never receive the same sort of treatment that a white heavyweight champ would, or a white gold medal boxing champion. And so, through his friendship with Malcolm and other members of the Nation of Islam, he joins the Nation of Islam. And as you might imagine, the Nation meaning the Nation of Islam, are pretty excited about this. To have one of the most famous athletes in the world join your cause and be willing to say things that align with the Nation of Islam theology, be able to speak positively of Elijah Muhammad, it's a pretty big deal. Now, eventually, Malcolm and Muhammad Ali will move towards Sunni Islam. Um, but still, it's really important for those two figures to be associated with the Nation of Islam. It gives them a really important and positive reputation in Black communities that these two really important, well-spoken, funny, charismatic, handsome men have joined the Nation of Islam because they've recognized that they can't make it, or that they will never receive the same treatment as white folks in Christian America. They should seek to be with their own, for their own, and thereby join the Nation of Islam and join with the Nation of Islam.
Okay. By the way, what was Malcolm X's religion before he converted?
I mean, so broadly Protestant. So his father seemed to preach from time to time, but it broadly Protestant is probably the best way of putting it. He definitely had a Protestant orientation to the world.
Okay. What was America's reaction to Muhammad Ali joining the Nation of Islam?
They were really not thrilled, especially as Muhammad Ali will also refuse to join the draft or to be drafted by the U.S. Army in the 1960s. And it's pretty unreal, actually, for us to think today about what that cost him personally and professionally. So we can imagine if, I don't know, LeBron James, Shohei Ohtani, Katie Ledecky, if they suddenly gave something up, Simone Biles, if they gave something up in the peak of their career to take a political stance for something, you're going to face a lot of blowback. While there may be a lot of support, there's also going to be a lot of powerful people who are pushing against that narrative. And this is something that the Nation of Islam picks up on. And in their newspaper, which they called Muhammad Speaks, there are a lot of political cartoons, there are lots of interviews or coverage of what Muhammad Ali is doing, even if at this time he's actually starting to slowly move away towards Sunni Islam. Um, it's really important because it aligns with their message of we do not owe the United States anything. They have not given us what they promised they would.
Okay. Talk to us about Elijah's death and what happened after Elijah Muhammad's passing.
Yeah, so Elijah Muhammad passes in early 1975, and this is something that can be really tricky for any number of religious groups. I've already mentioned Kathleen Flake, one of my mentors, but she wrote a really great article about a decade ago when the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, whose name was Gordon B. Hinckley, passed away, talking about how do you bury a prophet? And essentially, how do you make sure that this charismatic authority, the authority of the institution of the church, move forward? And so for the Nation of Islam, this is an open question. There was no sort of set understanding for who would be the next leader of the church, although it was broadly understood that it would be a member of Elijah Muhammad's family. And his son, Warith Dean Muhammad, as he is later known, takes the reins of the Nation of Islam. And part of what's compelling here to me as a historian is that he actually moves away from insisting that Muslims separate from white society. He separates from saying all white people are devils. He starts to slow pedal away from this narrative and aligns the group that his father led with Sunni Islam. Uh, in fact, connecting to other Black Muslims, Bilal, he first calls the group the Bilalians, changing it from the Nation of Islam. There's also going to be the World Community of Islam in the West, but eventually he's going to settle on the name the American Muslim Mission as the name of the religion that he's going to lead. And I can understand if listeners here are saying, wait, I've heard of the Nation of Islam. It still exists today. And you're absolutely right. It's led by Louis Farrakhan, but what he calls restores the Nation of Islam in the early 1980s. Because Farrakhan and other many members of the Nation of Islam liked the idea of racial separation, liked the idea of having a rational explanation for Black superiority, for countering white supremacy. And so Louis Farrakhan restores the Nation of Islam in the early 1980s and becomes a really important national and international speaker for Black rights. Um, Perhaps culminating in 1995 with his leadership of the Million Man March in Chicago, echoing the 1963 Civil Rights March for Jobs and Freedom in Washington, D.C., with pushing for Black equality, better pay, better living conditions for Black Americans. Now, part of what I want to draw attention here to as well is that Warith Deen Muhammad is thinking broadly, meaning he's thinking global. He is connecting his father's religious movement to other Black Sunni groups across the world. Louis Farrakhan is very focused on the United States. That isn't to say that completely dismissing the needs of Black Muslims or any Muslims anywhere, but rather is continuing to focus on the needs, the priorities, the urgencies that are faced by Muslims in America.
Okay. So does his organization still exist?
So Warith Deen Muhammad's organization does still exist. It's called the American Muslim Mission. And it's a relatively small group. This is something that, as someone who thinks a lot about how religion acts in society, once you're less distinctive, it can be harder to grow because you don't have a message that is immediately compelling or like, I had never thought about it that way before. The Nation of Islam also continues to exist under Louis Farrakhan and his leadership. And it's a much smaller group than the one that Elijah Muhammad oversaw. I'm not sure on numbers, but am pretty confident that it's under 250,000 practicing members today. He continues to be an important leader on the American religious landscape. So again, just like a small group like the Nation of Islam in the 1950s was able to create a lot of political possibilities because of their radicalism, so too with the Nation of Islam, but often in different directions. So something that I wrote about a few years ago is that Louis Farrakhan and Marjorie Taylor Greene um, were hand in glove in thinking about the COVID-19 vaccine, for instance, and thinking about how Black religion, about how all religion in the United States cannot be fit into one box. It cannot be totally embodied in one person, but rather that there are as many ways of practicing or believing or feeling religious as there are people to practice or believe or feel that way.
Okay. So, what are one or two misconceptions about the Nation of Islam that you'd like to address?
Yeah, so the first one being the idea that they're called Black Muslims. This is something that the group really rejects. And this is also just something to keep in mind that there are many Muslims across the spectrum of people who identify as Muslims who are of Black African descent, who are African Americans. And sometimes all of these groups are lumped into the Nation of Islam. In popular culture, one example I can think of, if folks ever watched The Wire on HBO, Brother Muzone is presented as a pretty stereotypical Nation of Islam member with a bow tie and wearing a suit at all times. Uh, so this stereotype exists of the Black Muslim as a member of the Nation of Islam. There are far more uh, adherents to Islam who are Black in America than belong to the Nation of Islam. The second, and something that I always find compelling, is that many folks will argue that the Nation of Islam is a political group and not a religious group. And this is something that sticks in my craw for many reasons, not least of which is that uh, all people exist in political environments and all movements, all ideas and traditions, religions exist in political environments. And so you cannot escape being political. So I'm saying that from the beginning. But to say that a group is not religious when they primarily identify themselves as members of a religious group or steadfastly identify themselves as Muslim, it seems insulting and just completely beyond the pale to say that they are a political group only and not a
Right.
group of faith.
Okay. Fair enough. By the way, we didn't touch on this earlier, but as far as Nation of Islam and religious doctrines they were known for, besides the ones that you mentioned.
So a lot of folks will think about the Nation of Islam as very violent people or those who live outside the confines of the law. And this is because they say that Martin Luther King's approach to Black civil rights would not work in the long run because white supremacy was too strong. They were not violent for the sake of being violent, but rather would say, if you're going to hit me, I'm going to hit you back. And so that was a pretty radical message then and now for many Christians in the United States, especially Black Christians. And so that sort of discipline, though, to only hit after you are hit is part of it, um, and is also emblematic of other aspects of religious life in the Nation of Islam, like dressing your best, always being well groomed, eating good, nutritious food, and abstaining from alcohol and tobacco. So that would be the third thing, I think, is just to think about the sort of discipline that the Nation of Islam embodies and asks of its members. Um, just to keep in mind that it's not just a religious group that is hell-bent on white destruction, but rather would define itself as sustaining Black excellence in anticipation of the return of Allah in the form of a Black man.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joseph. Uh, Two last questions. Why is it important, Joseph, that Americans understand the Nation of Islam?
So one, just because I think it's a fundamental duty to understand people how and where they are, to understand their orientation to the world, to build bridges between different groups that folks and individuals, communities can have different ways of belonging, but that we all have to figure out a way to make things work in the United States. That's the beauty of freedom of religion, but it's also one of those things that costs a lot and takes a lot of effort to actually enact in any political landscape, but perhaps especially now in the American religious landscape.
Okay, fair enough. Last, as we conclude, Joseph, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from today's subject, Nation of Islam, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative?
I think the first thing that I would say for what I've taken away in studying the Nation of Islam is the importance of understanding how and why people act the way they do. I think at the end of the day, religion has to work for someone on some level, broadly conceived, for folks to continue to believe or practice or otherwise associate with a religion. And so, with the Nation of Islam, understanding the conditions that it arose in and continues to exist in, it speaks to me as a white scholar of the need to continue to root out racism and to move forward in trying to make the world a better place, not through violence, but through education and through affirming dignity and self respect. One of the ways in which I'm moving in my book is thinking about the Nation of Islam um, as its own independent sovereign nation that is calibrated to destroy the empire that Jim Crow existed and thrived in. And so it just helps me to think as a historian, while the individuals are extremely important, so not just Elijah Muhammad, not just W.D. Farad or Brother Malcolm or Muhammad Ali, but also those who joined the Nation of Islam whose names we may never know. But nevertheless, that the religion meant a whole lot to them because it oriented them to the world in a way in which they could see themselves as being made in God's image and having contributions to make to their families, their communities, and the broader world around them.
Okay, well said. You have the last word. We have been talking with Joseph Stuart, Assistant Professor of History at Brigham Young University. Joseph, I can't thank you enough for the time you spent with us today.
A joy and a pleasure. Thanks so much, Chris.
The podcast series Religion in the American Experience is a project of the National Museum of American Religion. Episodes will be released monthly on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.